I will never forget the way the light hit his face that morning, how it made him look almost unrecognizable to me, as though the man I had lived beside for years had been replaced by someone colder, someone already half gone. The phone had rung early, an unusual hour for family news, and when he answered, his tone shifted instantly from the dull impatience of habit to something sharp, electric, tinged with greed. He did not look at me when he listened, only stared out the window, fingers drumming against the counter, eyes glassy with something that had nothing to do with grief or remembrance of the uncle who had passed away. By the time he hung up, his breath came fast and shallow, and he muttered the words as if they were holy scripture. $15 million. I thought, perhaps foolishly, that this would be a moment we would face together, that wealth of such magnitude would bring with it decisions, responsibilities, maybe even new beginnings. Instead, it revealed with merciless clarity who he really was. He did not speak to me at first, not until the lawyer's office confirmed the transfer and the details were laid bare. Then he turned, almost reluctant, and the corners of his mouth tightened into something between a smile and a grimace. "I don't need you anymore," he said, his voice strangely calm, as though he were announcing the weather. Those words landed harder than any scream or insult could have, because they were flat, unemotional, as though our years together, my sacrifices, my loyalty, had been reduced to nothing more than temporary scaffolding now torn down. He began to move through the house methodically, pulling clothes from the closet, stacking them into suitcases, tossing away the small tokens of shared life as if they were clutter. His movements had a rehearsed quality, as though he had been waiting for this exact moment, planning the exodus in silence. I stood there in the doorway of our bedroom, watching him fold shirts and slam drawers, and I felt the weight of 1,000 days press against me all at once. My mind replayed the long nights when I had stayed awake so he could sleep, the times I had cut back on my own ambitions so he could chase his, the quiet endurance I had offered when money was scarce, and we were counting coins to pay bills. I had carried him through storms, believing we were tethered to the same boat, and now, on the day the seas turned calm, he abandoned me without hesitation. His eyes did not even flicker with guilt. They gleamed only with anticipation of a future he imagined was brighter without me. When I asked if he was serious, he barely glanced at me. "You'll be fine," he muttered, zipping up a suitcase. "This changes everything. You don't understand. Money like this, it makes me free." He said the word free, as if our marriage had been chains, as if I had been the jailer, rather than the one holding the walls up around us so he could dream inside them. He took his watch from the nightstand, the one I had given him years ago when we celebrated an anniversary, and slipped it on without acknowledgement. It was as though the man I had known had been surgically removed, replaced with a stranger made entirely of greed and arrogance. I did not cry. The absence of tears surprised even me, but something inside had gone still, frozen in place, not with numbness, but with clarity. His words echoed in my head, "I don't need you anymore," and instead of breaking me, they crystallized something sharp, something I had not allowed myself to feel until then. He thought the money had severed me from relevance, had erased my value in his world. What he did not know, what he could not have guessed, was that the fortune he clung to so desperately was not as independent of me as he assumed. The roots of that inheritance had been planted long before him, intertwined with my name in ways he had never bothered to notice. He packed his final bag and rolled it through the living room, his movements brisk, efficient, already detached. At the door, he paused just long enough to look at me, and there was something almost triumphant in his smirk. "Don't wait for me," he said casually, as though it were a kindness. Then he stepped outside, dragging the weight of his new riches with him, not realizing that the house behind him still held the silence of someone who would not break, someone who was already calculating in ways he had never imagined. The door closed, and the echo of it resounded through the rooms like a gunshot, final and absolute. I stood alone, surrounded by the remnants of a shared life that had been dismantled in a matter of hours, and yet I did not crumble. Instead, I allowed myself a long, steady breath, the kind you take before making a decisive move. He believed he had walked out with everything, but what he carried was only an illusion of freedom, a mirage that would dissolve the moment he reached for what was never truly his to command. He thought he had discarded me like old furniture, unnecessary and forgotten. What he failed to see was that I was not the one left behind. I was the one holding the key to everything he thought he owned. That was the day my marriage ended. Not with a fight, not with accusations or pleas, but with a quiet declaration of his betrayal and a door closing behind him. It was also the day something inside me shifted forever. I would not be the abandoned wife he expected, writhing in despair and begging for scraps of affection or promises. No, I would be silent, patient, and deliberate, watching as the very foundation of his arrogance began to crack beneath his feet. He had inherited money, yes, but what he truly inherited that day was a storm he could never escape. The night after he left, the house felt cavernous, too large for a single body to occupy, yet not suffocating in the way I once feared loneliness would be. Instead of despair, there was a peculiar calm that settled in the silence, a silence he would have mistaken for weakness if he could have seen me. I moved slowly through the rooms, not touching the suitcases he had left behind in his haste, not tearing apart the remnants of his presence like a woman scorned. I sat at the kitchen table where the faint smell of his cologne still lingered and let the quiet seep into me, filling the places where grief should have been. The silence became armor, a protective cloak that allowed me to observe my pain without being consumed by it. He thought I would collapse, call him endlessly, beg him to remember the years we had spent side by side. That was the man he believed he had left behind, a woman, fragile enough to be defined by his presence. But I had lived long enough to understand that silence is not surrender. It is preparation. I recalled the way his eyes gleamed when he said those words. I don't need you anymore. As if the money had erased not only our marriage, but my existence itself. In his mind, the inheritance made him invincible, untethered from any past obligations. He failed to see how little he truly knew about the structure of that wealth, how little he had paid attention when the details were discussed years ago, and how blind arrogance can make even the most fortunate man a fool. As I sat in that silence, I did not feel erased. I felt sharpened. The quiet was not the absence of power, but its concentration, coiling within me like a spring waiting for the right moment to release. In the days that followed, I moved through life with deliberate restraint. I went to work, exchanged pleasantries with neighbors, carried out errands, all without betraying the storm building inside me. To anyone who looked, I was composed, perhaps even numb, but beneath that surface was an awareness so acute that every detail seemed illuminated. I checked the accounts, not out of desperation, but to confirm what I already knew. His name was not the one the money depended on. The funds sat dormant, inaccessible without the signature that only I could provide. And though the law firm had not yet informed him fully, I knew the truth would catch up to him soon enough. I could have reached out, confronted him with it immediately, but there was no satisfaction in rushing. Silence, after all, was my most effective weapon. I thought back to the early years of our marriage, when silence had been the language I used to survive disappointment, when arguments erupted over bills, or when dreams were postponed yet again. I had learned not to shout, but to absorb, to wait, to endure. At the time, I believed that silence was compliance, that I was shrinking myself to keep peace alive. But now, in the wake of his betrayal, I saw that silence could be something else entirely. It could be a strategy, a stage on which others revealed their truest selves while I remained concealed. He believed my quiet meant weakness. In truth, it meant I was invisible to his calculations, and therefore dangerous in ways he could not predict. The phone began to buzz within days of his departure. First came short messages, updates about parties he was attending, places he was visiting, as if he expected me to watch from the sidelines and feel the sting of being excluded. Then the tone shifted. Questions slipped into his words, disguised as casual but heavy with intent. Had I spoken with a lawyer? Did I know when the funds would be available? His bravado cracked slightly with each new attempt, though he tried to cover it with forced charm. I did not answer. My silence became a mirror in which his desperation reflected back at him, though he could not yet name it. At night, I imagined him sitting in some lavish hotel suite, glass in hand, surrounded by people eager to spend what they believed he had. I could almost hear the hollow laughter, the false praise, the way his ego would inflate under their shallow admiration. And yet, I also knew how quickly such people vanish when the flow of money is interrupted. The silence I gave him was not just punishment. It was a rope, and he was already wrapping it around himself, knot by knot, unaware that I was holding the other end. There were moments when anger surged, when memories of sacrifices made for him threatened to choke me. But even then, I did not break my quiet. I wrote in journals. I walked long hours in the evening. I let the anger drain into the pages and the pavement until only clarity remained. If I had screamed at him, if I had demanded answers, I would have given him power, confirming his belief that he mattered enough to unmake me. By remaining silent, I denied him that satisfaction and preserved my energy for the confrontation I knew would come. A week passed, each day layering my composure more firmly, while his mask surely began to crack. The lawyer would have told him by now what he had failed to grasp in his eagerness to abandon me. The inheritance was not truly his. He must have replayed his choices in his mind, realizing that the words he had thrown at me, "I don't need you anymore," were not only cruel, but ruinously premature. I imagined his pride colliding with reality, the hollow echo of his laughter in those first nights replaced by the cold weight of dependence, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the silence drove him back to my door, not out of love or remorse, but out of necessity. In that waiting, in that deliberate quiet, I discovered a strength I had not known I possessed. I had been underestimated for so long that even I had begun to believe I was small, insignificant in the shadow of his ambitions. But the silence revealed something different, that I was the axis around which the story turned, that my restraint was not invisibility, but control. He thought I was the one left behind, but in truth, I was the one standing still while he spun himself into ruin. And when the knock on the door finally came, when his voice cracked on the other side, begging for the attention he once dismissed, it was not surprise that I felt, but inevitability. The silence had done its work. It had not been empty. It had been a crucible, shaping me into someone he could never have imagined, someone who no longer needed to raise her voice to be heard, because the absence of words had already carved the truth into his bones. It is strange how people can live alongside something for years and never once bother to understand the structure beneath it, as if believing that wealth or legacy is simply a prize to be collected, detached from the foundations that give it weight. That was his first mistake, and perhaps his most fatal one. He assumed that $15 million dropped into his lap would be his to command, free and clear, like water rushing from a faucet, endless and unquestionable. He never stopped to ask himself why the lawyer's voice trembled slightly when explaining the details over the phone, why there had been mention of my name in earlier conversations long before the inheritance was finalized, why his uncle had trusted me in ways he had never truly trusted him. If he had listened, if he had read carefully, he would have known that the roots of this fortune were entangled with me, that the soil in which it grew was not his to claim alone. I had known the man who left him this inheritance long before I had even married. His uncle was a stern but fair man, someone who valued loyalty above all else, who despised arrogance and wastefulness, who looked at people not for their words, but for how they carried themselves when no one else was watching. He had watched me through the years with a quiet appraisal, seeing how I managed the household when times were lean, how I endured disappointments without breaking, how I supported his nephew even when the nephew gave little in return. His respect was not voiced loudly, but I felt it in the small ways, an extra smile at family gatherings, the way he sought my opinion in private, the glimmer of approval when he saw me steady what his nephew had unsteadied. When he fell ill, when whispers of impending death crept into the family, he made decisions that surprised some, but not me. He had built his fortune carefully, piece by piece, and he wanted it safeguarded. He knew his nephew's flaws, the recklessness, the hunger for display without the patience to build. And so, quietly, in the language of legal documents and signatures that my husband never cared to read, he anchored the inheritance to me. My name was written where it mattered most, not as a courtesy, not as a gesture, but as the fulcrum upon which all access depended. Without my approval, The millions would remain locked, untouched, like a glittering mirage visible but unreachable. My husband thought he had inherited freedom. What he had inherited was the reflection of his own ignorance. The irony was almost cruel. For years he had dismissed my habit of reading fine print, of asking questions when papers were put before us, of keeping careful track of accounts. He would laugh, wave a hand, tell me I worried too much, that life was simpler than I made it. He would scorn my meticulousness, calling it unnecessary, even obsessive. And yet, it was precisely that trait, my insistence on clarity, my refusal to be blind, that had earned his uncle's trust. While he saw my diligence as weakness, the old man had seen it as strength, as proof that his legacy would not be squandered in vanity. My husband had never noticed that respect, too blinded by his own assumption of superiority to realize that someone else had been watching, weighing, and deciding where true reliability lay. The will itself was a labyrinth of clauses, conditions, and stipulations, designed not to deny him the money outright, but to ensure he would never wield it without my consent. On the surface, the sum appeared to be his. Beneath the surface, the foundation was entirely mine. To him, this seemed like a technicality, something that could be brushed aside or perhaps ignored. To me, it was the key. And when I learned that he had stormed out with his suitcases, abandoning me under the illusion that he no longer needed the weight of our shared history, I understood immediately that he was already building his empire on air. I let him revel in it, let him strut with the arrogance of imagined wealth, let him buy dinners for sycophants and whisper about the trips he would take, the houses he would own, the people he would impress. I knew that every promise he made, every indulgence he began to plan, was balanced on a foundation he did not control. And in that knowledge, there was a satisfaction far deeper than anger could have offered. His downfall would not come from my hand striking him. It would come from his own blindness colliding with the truth. In the quiet moments, I revisited my last conversations with his uncle. I remembered the way his voice, weakened but still firm, had told me not to let the boy's arrogance ruin everything. He thinks the world owes him, the old man had said, his breath shallow. But the world owes nothing. You, however, know the weight of things. I trust you to hold it. At the time, I had not fully understood the burden of those words, but now they rang like prophecy. My husband believed he had inherited wealth, when in truth, what he had inherited was a mirror of his own dependence on me. When the lawyer finally explained the structure to him, I imagine his expression must have twisted from triumph to confusion, from confusion to outrage. Perhaps he shouted, perhaps he threatened, perhaps he demanded explanations he would never fully grasp. But paper does not bend to temper. Contracts do not unravel under anger. The ink was dry, the signatures immutable, the authority rooted in my name. He had left me behind thinking he had escaped, when in reality, he had chained himself tighter to me than ever before. And so I waited, the will folded neatly in my drawer, my silence not merely patience, but the quiet certainty of victory. He thought I was powerless, discarded, forgotten. But in truth, I was the axis on which the entire fortune turned. Every step he took away from me only brought him closer to the moment when he would realize that his freedom had been an illusion from the start. I could almost map his movements without needing to follow him, because men like him are predictable when they are convinced they have stumbled upon a fortune that will remake their lives. He was intoxicated with the idea of $15 million, and intoxicated men follow the same rituals. They boast, they spend, they surround themselves with applause, and they mistake the hollow sound of that applause for permanence. In the first week after he walked out, dragging his suitcases and his arrogance behind him, I imagined the path he carved for himself with frightening clarity. I knew where he would go, who he would call, the kinds of people who would swarm toward him like flies to sugar. He had waited for this chance his entire life, and in that first week, he gorged himself on the illusion of independence like a starving man at a banquet, never realizing that every bite was poisoned by his own ignorance. I did not see him, but word travels fast, and people love to talk when money enters the air. I heard about him through whispers, through the careful way acquaintances let slip fragments of his new lifestyle, eager to see how I would react. They did not understand that their tidings were less like wounds and more like confirmations of the picture I already carried in my head. He rented a suite in one of the city's finest hotels, where crystal glasses and velvet curtains became the backdrop to his reinvention. He threw dinners with extravagant menus, paid for with credit lines he assumed would soon be backed by liquid wealth. He appeared at gatherings with a different woman on his arm, her smile painted bright and empty, her laugh tuned to the pitch of his self-importance. He bought watches, tailored suits, whispered to friends about houses he would acquire in Europe, boats he would dock in Mediterranean harbors. He was living as if the money already pulsed through his veins, as if the inheritance was not just promised, but already deposited into his very soul. In my kitchen, where the silence wrapped around me like a fortress, I imagined those scenes unfolding. I pictured him holding court at a table surrounded by opportunists, bragging about ventures he would fund, charities he would consider, vacations that would blur the line between fantasy and reality. His words would have been endless, but none of them grounded. He was a man building castles in the air, too drunk on his imagined dominion to notice that the ground beneath him had not shifted an inch. Every boast, every receipt signed, every empty promise made him sink further into a quicksand of his own making. By the third day, I was certain he had already begun to overextend himself. He never knew restraint, never understood that wealth is preserved not by spending, but by waiting, calculating, protecting. I could see him promising loans to old friends, offering gifts he could not yet provide, imagining that my signature, the one detail he had overlooked, was a formality that would resolve itself in time. Perhaps he even reassured himself that he could charm me back into compliance, that he could wave away his cruelty with the same hand he had once used to dismiss my questions. In his mind, I was still the quiet wife who tolerated storms to keep the peace. He had no idea that the silence he remembered had transformed into something unrecognizable to him, a silence sharpened into steel, a silence that observed and waited for his inevitable fall. The women came quickly, I am sure. Wealth, or even the rumor of it, has a scent that attracts those eager to taste its sweetness without caring about the rot beneath. He had never been difficult to sway with flattery, and now, with the glow of imagined millions behind him, he must have felt untouchable. I imagined the nights in those hotel rooms, where laughter dulled into emptiness once the alcohol wore off, where the faces beside him were as interchangeable as the champagne bottles left uncorked. He mistook their presence for validation, not realizing they were parasites waiting to drain what he could not provide. Every indulgence, every fleeting kiss, every shallow encounter was another crack in the facade of his new life. I kept to my silence, never reaching out, never answering the messages that began to trickle in from him when reality first brushed against his fantasy. At first they were casual, updates written in tones of arrogance, as if I were expected to watch him soar from the ground. Then, little hints of unease crept in, questions disguised as pleasantries, inquiries about when certain documents would be finalized, attempts to mask his worry behind the shield of nonchalance. I did not reply. I let him stew in the luxury of his own confusion, let him perform his new role until the script betrayed him. The first week was not freedom for him. It was a test. He thought he had shed me like old skin, thought he had cast aside the life that tethered him, but I knew better. That week was his stage, and he danced under the lights without realizing that the floorboards were already splintering beneath him. Every bill signed, every promise uttered, every indulgence claimed was another weight pressing down on a structure that would collapse the moment he discovered that the fortune he flaunted could not be touched without me. For me, those days were not torment, but a revelation of my own resilience. I no longer measured my worth by his presence or his approval. Instead, I measured it by my ability to sit in stillness while the storm he had chosen tore through his imagined paradise. I did not envy his freedom because I knew it was not freedom at all. It was shackles forged from arrogance and blindness. And so I waited, knowing that his week of triumph was merely the prelude to desperation, that the noise he surrounded himself with would soon fall silent, leaving him with nothing but the echo of his own folly. The first week of his new life was, in truth, the first week of his undoing. He just hadn't realized it yet. There is always a moment, sharp as a blade, when fantasy collides with fact, when the intoxication of illusion wears off and leaves only the raw sting of truth. For him, that moment arrived sooner than he could have anticipated, though I had known from the beginning it would come. The dream he had built in that first week, lavish hotel suites, extravagant meals, new companions whose loyalty was purchased with nothing but his promises, began to unravel under the weight of reality. The abyss between what he believed he had inherited and what was actually his to control widened with every passing day, and it was into that abyss that he would soon tumble. It began, I am certain, with the banks. Institutions do not care for arrogance or charm. They bow only to signatures, clauses, and verifications. When he first attempted to withdraw beyond what his personal accounts held, when he tried to move funds that remained locked in trust, he would have discovered the first barrier: my name, etched firmly into the documents he had never cared to read. I can almost hear his voice at the teller's desk, smooth at first, confident, then tight with irritation as explanations were given to him that he could not comprehend. He must have leaned forward, insisted there was some mistake, repeated the figure of 15 million like a mantra, as though uttering it loudly enough would make it materialize in his hands. But banks are not swayed by repetition or rage, and when they told him the truth, that the money remained inaccessible without my authorization, the first threads of his illusion snapped. Yet pride is a stubborn thing, and I imagine he convinced himself that it was merely a delay, a small inconvenience that would soon be resolved. He returned to his hotel, to his dinners and companions, and continued to spend what little he could leverage, clinging to the belief that the millions were his, waiting just beyond the horizon. But the abyss yawned wider as the bills piled up, as the credit limits neared exhaustion, as the eager faces that once surrounded him began to turn impatient. Promises lose their luster when they are not fulfilled, and those who had basked in his generosity began to whisper doubts. Their laughter, once so loud and eager, grew strained, brittle, and finally silent. By the middle of that week, he must have felt the ground beneath him begin to tilt. Calls to the lawyer would have been met with the same explanation. My name was the fulcrum upon which everything balanced. Without me, he held nothing more than paper. His anger must have flared, his voice rising, his demands echoing down the sterile corridors of law offices. But paper does not bend to fury. He had built his dream on air, and the air was dissipating. The abyss was no longer distant. It loomed at his feet. I did not need to see his unraveling to know it was happening. The silence between us told me more than words could. His messages shifted tone, the casual arrogance of the first days replaced by strained politeness, then by urgency. He asked questions he had once scorned me for even considering. Had I spoken to the lawyers? Had I signed anything? Did I know when the funds would clear? The transformation was almost poetic. The man who had declared that he did not need me anymore now found himself tethered so tightly to me that he could not breathe without my consent. And still, I gave him nothing. My silence became the abyss itself, widening the chasm between his dream and his reality until he had no choice but to see the truth. In his world, which had once seemed so grand, cracks spread rapidly. The hotel staff who had greeted him with deference began to look at him differently, measuring his worth not by his boasts, but by the unpaid balances. The women who had clung to his arm began to drift away, their interest dimming as the glow of wealth turned out to be only smoke. Friends who had cheered his fortune now avoided his calls, unwilling to be caught in the collapse of his facade. Each departure left him more exposed, more alone, until the echo of his own folly was the only company he had left. And as he hovered at the edge of the abyss, peering down into the emptiness of his own making, I remained still. I did not reach for him, did not throw him a rope, did not extend even a word to bridge the gap. For this was the truth he had crafted, the reality he had chosen when he packed his bags and told me he no longer needed me. It was not my task to rescue him from the abyss. My task was only to wait, to watch, to let the silence do its work until he understood that his dream had never been real, that it had always been mine to define, mine to release, mine to withhold. The abyss between dream and reality is merciless, and once a man steps too far, there is no return. He had stepped willingly, joyfully even, believing the ground was solid. Now, as he flailed against the emptiness, The truth rose around him like cold stone walls. The inheritance was not his. The fortune was not his. And without me, he had nothing. And soon enough, he would be forced to face that truth, not in the privacy of offices or hotel rooms, but on his knees at my door. It did not take long for his silence to fracture. At first he must have believed he could solve everything alone, that the weight of his personality, the bravado that had carried him through countless smaller deceptions, would be enough to bend rules and smooth over obstacles. But when doors began to close and explanations grew colder, when the money he believed was his remained locked beyond reach, his pride started to crumble. That was when the first messages arrived. Careful at first, cautious in their tone, as though he were speaking not to me, but to a version of me he remembered from years ago, the wife who forgave, who soothed, who picked up broken pieces while pretending not to notice the hand that had dropped them. His words were crafted to seem light, almost playful, updates about his new ventures, little notes about how quickly life could change, as though he wanted me to be impressed by the empire he imagined himself building. But beneath the surface of those words, I felt the tension, the tightness in his breath that reached me even through text. I did not reply. That silence was deliberate, and with every unanswered message, I knew the weight pressed harder against him. He shifted tactics within days. Politeness gave way to curiosity disguised as concern. "Have you spoken to the lawyer?" he asked. "Did you receive the paperwork?" As though this were an administrative inconvenience we could resolve together. His arrogance had begun to soften, the edge of desperation dulling his sentences. I could picture him alone in that hotel room, phone in hand, pacing the floor with the same restlessness that had once driven him to snap at me for trivial things. But this time, there was no one to absorb his impatience, no one to answer his demands. Then came the calls. At first, 1 or 2 a day, always at odd hours, as if he hoped to catch me in a moment of weakness. The sound of his voice on the line, strained but carefully masked with casualness, filled the space I refused to grant him. He spoke as though nothing had happened, as though he had not looked me in the eyes and told me I was unnecessary. He spoke of the inheritance as if it were already his, mentioning plans and ideas, dropping names of people he was associating with, as if he were reminding me of the grand world I was missing by staying away. But I heard what lay beneath. The cracks, the faltering confidence, the way his words trailed too long before he cut the line. When those attempts failed, his tone hardened. The patience slipped, and the first sharp words arrived. He accused me of ignoring him deliberately, of enjoying watching him struggle, of being cold. It was almost amusing, how quickly he forgot that he had been the one to close the door, to declare my irrelevance. Now, suddenly, my silence was his prison, and every unanswered call was another link in the chain he had forged for himself. I did not allow myself even the smallest response, not a word, not a sign that I was listening. Because I was listening, not to his voice, but to the way desperation was reshaping him, carving away the arrogance he had worn like armor, leaving behind the raw truth of a man who had gambled everything and lost. Friends began to reach out to me, some with genuine concern, others with thinly veiled curiosity. They told me he had been asking after me, that he wanted to speak, that he was not doing well. They expected me to soften, to be moved by pity. But pity had no place in the silence I had chosen. I remembered too clearly the smirk on his face when he told me he no longer needed me, the way he packed his things without hesitation, as though I had been nothing more than a burden he was glad to shed. That memory kept me steady, reminded me that silence was not cruelty, but justice. His attempts escalated further. Flowers arrived at the house, bouquets of roses with notes that tried to summon romance from a grave already dug. I left them to wither at the door, their petals falling one by one until only dry stems remained, a reflection of the decay of whatever love had once lived between us. Gifts followed, boxes wrapped in expensive paper, items he thought might tempt me, as if money or luxury could replace the trust he had shattered. I did not open them. They piled up in corners, unopened and unwanted, silent testaments to the futility of his gestures. The silence was not easy. There were nights when the phone buzzed relentlessly on the table beside me, when the temptation to answer, to unleash all the words I carried, was sharp enough to cut. But I resisted, because I understood something he never would. Silence can be more powerful than speech. Words might have given him fuel to twist, to argue, to find some foothold in the crumbling walls around him. Silence gave him nothing but his own reflection, forced him to face the emptiness he had created. By the end of that week, the desperation in his attempts had become unmistakable. Gone was the man of pride, the man who thought $15 million had made him untouchable. In his place was someone unraveling, someone who had begun to understand that his future rested entirely in the hands of the woman he had cast aside. And still, I waited, because I knew the day would come when messages and calls would no longer be enough, when he would be forced to do what he swore he would never do again, return to my door, not as a husband, not as an equal, but as a beggar. It was inevitable that his scattered messages and unanswered calls would eventually collapse into something more tangible, something desperate enough to drag him back to the very threshold he had once abandoned with smug certainty. I had imagined the scene many times in the solitude of my silence, picturing the day he would be forced to swallow his pride and appear before me, no longer the man of bravado who had declared me unnecessary, but the hollowed version of himself, stripped of pretense, carrying only the weight of failure. When that knock finally came, it did not echo with authority or confidence. It was hesitant at first, then urgent, then nearly frantic, as though his fists against the wood were pleading more than demanding. And when I opened the door, the sight of him standing there was almost surreal, his suit disheveled, hair unkempt, eyes rimmed with sleeplessness, the very image of a man undone by his own illusions. He fell to his knees before words could even form, the weight of his collapse visible in the way his shoulders slumped, his hands trembling as they reached toward me with a pitiful mix of shame and entitlement. His voice cracked as he tried to explain, weaving apologies with excuses, desperation with claims of misunderstanding. He spoke of mistakes, of moments of weakness, of how he had been blinded by the suddenness of wealth, how he had lost sight of what truly mattered. The words poured out of him in torrents, flooding the quiet of the entryway, and yet each syllable carried the same hollow ring. He was not here for love, not for reconciliation, but for survival. He was here because the abyss he had created had finally devoured him, and he could see no escape without me. I listened without interruption, my silence now no longer the absence of sound, but a mirror in which he confronted himself. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that he was unraveling, that the man who had once looked at me with contempt now clung to me as though I were the only lifeline left in his drowning sea. He recounted the indignities he had suffered in the weeks since he left, the friends who had vanished when the money proved unreachable, the women who had drifted away when the champagne dried, the creditors who had begun to circle like vultures. He admitted to the humiliation of being turned away at banks, the frustration of hearing my name spoken again and again by lawyers as the key to everything he could not touch. Each confession was a nail in the coffin of the pride that had once defined him, each word a reminder that arrogance has a cost no man can afford when it collides with truth. And yet, as he knelt there, eyes red with shame, I felt no flicker of pity. Instead, I felt the steady strength of the silence I had cultivated, the power of having waited long enough for him to reveal himself fully, not as the triumphant heir he imagined, but as the broken man reality had carved from him. I thought of the moment he packed his bags, the smirk on his lips when he told me he no longer needed me, the finality of the door closing behind him. That memory rose like a shield, protecting me from the performance of his repentance. Because that was all it was, a performance, crafted not from love but from necessity, rehearsed in the lonely hours of his downfall until he could deliver it at my doorstep. He begged me to sign the papers, to release the funds, to allow him access to the fortune he still believed he could command. He promised everything: loyalty, gratitude, a fresh start, a life rebuilt together. His voice cracked on the word, together, and for a moment, he looked like a child lost in a world too big for him. But even then, I knew the truth. If the money had been his alone, if the fortune had flowed freely into his hands, he would never have returned. He would have vanished into his illusions, never sparing me a thought beyond the contempt with which he left. His return was not proof of love reborn, but evidence of dependence, a dependence he could not hide. no matter how eloquently he begged. I let the silence stretch between us, heavy and suffocating, until he faltered. His words slowed, then stopped, his eyes searching mine for any flicker of mercy. But I gave him none, because mercy, in that moment, would have meant betraying myself, undoing the strength I had forged in the quiet days of his absence. He had chosen to walk away, to discard me as unnecessary, and now he knelt before me, because the very choice that once made him feel powerful had reduced him to this. The irony was almost poetic, and I allowed myself the smallest, coldest smile at the realization. The return of the one who walked away was not the triumph he expected. It was not a reunion of love or forgiveness. It was the unveiling of truth, that in leaving, he had chained himself more tightly to me than he ever could have imagined. His wealth was nothing without my hand, his future nothing without my consent. And as he knelt there, begging for what he believed he deserved, I knew that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. He had left as a man certain of his independence, but he returned as a supplicant, stripped of all illusions, forced to confront the abyss he had tried so hard to ignore. There is a kind of laughter that does not emerge from humor, but from clarity, a sound born when the absurdity of a situation collides with the certainty of truth. It is not the laughter of joy or mockery, but of revelation, and it carries with it a coldness sharper than any blade. When he knelt before me, words spilling in desperate torrents, hands trembling as he pleaded for signatures and forgiveness, I let his confessions pile around us like rubble. He thought he was building a case for redemption, constructing a bridge back into my life. But all he was doing was exposing how far he had fallen from the pedestal on which he once placed himself. And when his voice cracked, when his eyes lifted to mine with the expectation that I would soften, that I would gather him into my arms and erase the cruelty of his own choices, I felt something rise within me that was stronger than anger, stronger than satisfaction. I felt laughter break through the silence I had carried like armor, and when it escaped my lips, it froze the air between us. He looked at me as though I had struck him, his expression collapsing into disbelief. He had prepared for resistance, for tears, perhaps even for rage, but not for laughter, not for the sound of me finding amusement in his undoing. My laughter was not loud, not manic, but low and deliberate, echoing in the narrow space of the entryway until it felt as though the walls themselves rejected his pleas. I saw him pale, his lips parting as if to speak but no words emerging. In that moment, the illusion he had clung to, the illusion that he still had power, that his begging might sway me, shattered into dust. "Sweetheart," I said finally, my voice steady, edged with the irony that only truth can sharpen, "did you forget whose name is on that inheritance?" The words landed heavier than any scream could have, for they revealed the simple, devastating truth he had refused to see, that all his posturing, his spending, his boasts of independence had been built on wealth that was never his to command. He blinked at me, as if hearing the sentence for the first time, though the reality of it had been written in documents all along. I watched recognition settle into his features, watched the fight drain from his body as though my words had severed the final thread holding his illusions together. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. He stared at me, searching for some trace of weakness, some sign that my laughter had been a cruel joke, and that mercy might still linger in me. But mercy was not what I carried in that moment. What I carried was the culmination of every sacrifice I had made, every slight I had endured, every quiet moment in which I had been dismissed. My laughter was the sound of balance restored, of scales tipping in favor of truth after years of being weighted with deceit. He tried briefly to recover. His words stumbled out again, softer now, less assured, fragments of apology mixed with promises he could never keep. But the rhythm had shifted, and he knew it. He was no longer a man petitioning for reconciliation. He was a beggar, grasping at scraps of dignity. And I, for the first time in years, felt no burden pressing against my chest, no guilt tethering me to his failures. I felt light, almost weightless, as though the chains he had once wrapped around me with his arrogance had been broken by nothing more than the sound of my own laughter. The room itself seemed to change in that instant. What had once felt like the stage of his performance became instead the site of his collapse, and my role shifted from passive witness to quiet arbiter. I did not need to shout or threaten, did not need to list his betrayals, or remind him of the night he walked out with his suitcases. All of it was contained in the laughter that had already pierced him more deeply than words could. He understood now, without question, that the power he thought he had possessed had never been his. It had always been mine, waiting in silence until the moment I chose to wield it. For a long while, neither of us moved. He remained on his knees, the weight of reality pressing him downward, while I stood above him, calm, collected, almost serene. The imbalance was striking, a reversal of roles so complete that it seemed almost theatrical. And yet it was real, painfully real for him, liberatingly real for me. My laughter still echoed in my mind, a reminder that sometimes the most devastating blow is not delivered through rage, but through the simple acknowledgement of how small a man becomes when stripped of his illusions. When he finally lowered his gaze, unable to meet mine, I knew the victory was complete. He had come to me expecting resistance he could overcome, expecting emotions he could manipulate, expecting the woman he had once controlled. Instead, he found someone who no longer needed to fight, because the battle had already been won in silence. My laughter had not just frozen him, it had ended him, ended the story he thought he was still writing. From that moment forward, the script belonged to me. There comes a moment when the truth, long hidden behind arrogance and denial, rises with such clarity that it cannot be ignored. A moment when the veil tears and what remains is the raw outline of reality. For him, that moment came not when he found himself on his knees at my door, not when my laughter shattered his last illusions, but when I spoke the words that revealed the flaw at the heart of his empire. He had been so quick to leave, so sure that wealth had granted him freedom, that he never stopped to consider what it meant to inherit, never stopped to read what was written in ink that did not fade with wishes. And so, when I told him he had forgotten to read the most important part, I saw the recognition flash in his eyes, a flicker of memory reaching back to conversations he had dismissed, to documents he had signed without thought, to the day he waved away the lawyer's meticulous explanations as if they were trivial. I did not raise my voice as I spoke. There was no need. Calmly, with the precision of someone who has carried the truth in silence long enough to wield it like a blade, I explained what he had never bothered to understand. The inheritance, though bearing his uncle's name and fortune, had been tied deliberately to me. My signature, my authorization, my presence, these were the locks and keys to the millions he had paraded before others as his own. Without me, the money remained untouched, resting in trust, untouchable no matter how many dinners he hosted, how many promises he made, how many women he bought fleeting loyalty from. He had mistaken potential for possession, and in that mistake, he had crafted his own ruin. He tried to interrupt, of course, tried to argue that it was his by right, that bloodlines and family ties guaranteed him access. But rights mean nothing against written contracts, and family ties mean little when a man's arrogance has already eroded trust. His uncle had known him too well, had seen the recklessness, the thirst for status without the discipline to maintain it, and so had placed the true power not in his hands but in mine. I reminded him of that, not with malice but with the steady certainty of someone reciting facts carved into stone. His protests weakened with every word, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the truth. He had never been the heir. He had been a dependent, tethered irrevocably to the woman he once thought beneath him. As I spoke, I could see him unravel, not in sudden bursts but in gradual collapse, like a structure whose foundations had been eaten away by time until the walls could no longer stand. The room felt smaller, tighter, as if the truth itself pressed against the air, leaving no space for the illusions he had carried. He looked around as though seeking escape, but there was none. Everything he had built in his mind, every boast he had made, every indulgence he had seized was revealed now as empty performance, financed not by reality, but by delusion. I leaned closer then, not to comfort, but to ensure he understood, to leave no ambiguity in the wreckage of his pride. "You left thinking you no longer needed me," I said, my voice low, deliberate, almost tender in its cruelty. "But every step you took away from me was built on money that was never yours. You begged for freedom. and yet the only way forward was always through me. You forgot to read the most important part, and now you are here, on your knees, because the truth does not bend to arrogance. His face crumpled, the last remnants of defiance draining away, and in their place rose something almost pitiful. For the first time, he looked not like a man, but like a boy who had played at being powerful until the game collapsed around him. His lips parted as if to form another plea, but the words caught in his throat, strangled by the realization that nothing he could say would alter what had been written years before he even imagined leaving me. The silence that followed was thick with finality, the kind that lingers not because there is more to be said, but because there is nothing left to say. And yet, within me, there was no gloating triumph, no blaze of revenge. There was only the cool satisfaction of balance restored, of knowing that justice had not required shouting or spectacle, but only patience, silence, and the inevitable unveiling of truth. I had carried this knowledge through his departure, through his boasts, through his week of indulgence, through his frantic calls, and now, as he knelt before me broken by it, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders, not because he suffered, but because he finally saw. The most important part of any story is not the grand gesture or the final scene, but the quiet detail that changes everything. He had forgotten to read that detail in the inheritance, had forgotten to see me as more than the shadow beside him, and in that forgetting, he had doomed himself. Now, with the truth laid bare, there was no going back, no way to rebuild what he had shattered with his arrogance. He was no longer the man who walked out with his bags full of clothes and his heart full of contempt. He was something smaller, humbler, a man forced to confront the fact that all along, the fortune, the future, the power, none of it had been his. And as he sat there in silence, pale and trembling, I knew this was not just his undoing, but my rebirth. When the door finally closed behind him, when his shadow no longer lingered on the threshold, and the echo of his pleas dissolved into the night, the house settled into a silence that was different from the one I had carried for weeks. This silence was not heavy or suffocating. It was clean, light, almost luminous, like air clearing after a storm. For the first time in years, I felt no tension pressing against my chest, no weight of expectation tethering me to someone else's demands. He had come to me on his knees. He had heard the truth he refused to face, and he had left stripped of the illusions that once made him arrogant. And in the hollow his absence left, I found something unexpected. Not emptiness, but space. Space to breathe, to exist, to rebuild a life not defined by betrayal or by his absence, but by my own quiet strength. I moved slowly through the house, touching the walls, the furniture, the details of a life that had once felt diminished by his disdain. Each corner now seemed altered, not because the objects had changed, but because I had. The kitchen table was no longer the place where I watched him take calls that dismissed me. It was where I sat with my silence and turned it into armor. The bedroom was no longer the stage of his hurried packing, but a sanctuary where I had learned to sleep alone without sorrow. Even the front door, once the mark of his departure, had become the witness to his collapse. Every space that had once held pain now felt reborn, redefined by the woman I had become. The fortune that had sparked his betrayal remained untouched in its accounts, but I no longer thought of it with the same sharp awareness. The money was not a weapon, not a shield, not even the essence of victory. It was simply a resource, one that would allow me to build the future I chose. His downfall had never been about the millions themselves. It had been about his blindness to the truth that wealth without integrity is nothing but dust. For me, the inheritance was not power. It was possibility. And in that possibility, I saw a life where I no longer bent myself to fit into his shadow, where I no longer carried the burden of someone else's ego, where I no longer mistook silence for weakness. In the weeks that followed, I began to shape that life. I spoke with the lawyers, not out of obligation but out of intention. I arranged my affairs with precision, choosing carefully where the money would be placed, what causes it would support, what doors it could open not for vanity but for growth. I allowed myself to imagine travel not as escape but as discovery, new places where I could walk untethered, new faces I could meet, without the weight of his judgment hovering over me. Slowly, I began to invest in myself, in dreams I had once folded away in the quiet corners of sacrifice. The inheritance was mine to steward, but the true wealth lay in the freedom to shape my days without his voice dictating my worth. There were whispers, of course, friends and relatives who wondered if I would take him back, who speculated about whether forgiveness was possible, who hinted that marriages are complicated and sometimes deserve second chances. I listened politely, but inside, my resolve never wavered. Forgiveness is not the same as return, and mercy is not the same as surrender. He had revealed himself with cruel clarity the day he told me I was unnecessary, and no amount of begging could erase that truth. I could forgive him for his blindness, perhaps even pity him for the ruin he created, but I would never allow myself to be reduced again to the silent shadow he had once believed me to be. At night, I often returned to the memory of my laughter, the sound that froze him, the sound that marked the turning point where power shifted irrevocably. That laughter was not cruelty. It was liberation. It was the moment I realized that strength does not always roar, that sometimes it whispers, sometimes it waits, sometimes it smiles coldly at the arrogance of those who believe you powerless. In that laughter, I heard the voice of the woman I had become, a voice I would carry with me long after his presence had vanished. The day he left with his suitcases had felt like an ending. The day he returned on his knees had felt like justice. But this quiet season of rebuilding, of reclaiming, felt like rebirth. I was not merely surviving betrayal. I was transcending it, stepping into a life where betrayal was not the final chapter, but the prologue to something stronger. He had tried to define me by his rejection, but I had redefined myself by my resilience. And in that truth, I found peace. When I stood before the mirror now, I no longer saw the woman he left behind. I saw someone new, someone tempered by silence, sharpened by patience, illuminated by truth. I saw a woman who had endured the cruelty of being discarded and had turned that cruelty into power. A woman who had been underestimated, dismissed, betrayed, and yet had risen not with vengeance burning in her veins, but with clarity guiding her steps. A woman reborn, not as someone's wife, someone's shadow, someone's necessity, but as her own. The rebirth of a betrayed woman is not loud, not dramatic, not gilded in spectacle. It is quiet, steady, relentless, like dawn breaking after the longest night. And as I stepped into that dawn, I knew with certainty that my life was no longer bound to the man who once thought he could live without me. My life was mine alone, and for the first time in years, that was enough.